Changing a country isn't easy, but change is inevitable. And the choices we make today will shape our country for generations to come. That's why we've published our first book from Australia Institute Press. What's the Big Idea offers 32 ideas for a better Australia, from leading thinkers such as Bob Brown, Sally McManus, Dr. Emma Shortis, and Professor Brian Schmidt. The essays are a roadmap and a reminder that the solutions exist. Australia just needs the courage to implement them. Visit australiainstitute.org.au or follow the link in the show notes to order your copy of What's the Big Idea today.
G'day and welcome to Dollars and Cents. It's the podcast where we explain what the hell is going on in the economy. And boy, there's things going on. I'm your host Hayden and I'll be filling in for Eleanor this week because she's in Tuvalu filming a documentary. So keep an eye out for that. It's sure to be an interesting watch. And I'm here as always with the incredible, the ineffable Greg Jericho.
Wow, ineffable. I don't even know if that's a compliment, but I'm going to take it.
I don't even know what it means, but it felt good to say it.
It felt good, and we're not in Tuvalu. We're here in sunny Canberra.
Sunny Canberra. It's sunny. It's warm. The birds are singing. It's a good day. Let's just jump right into it. So the monthly inflation data came out yesterday.
Well, after the release of new economic data, Aussies hoping for another rate cut may need to wait a little longer than they'd hoped.
Headline CPI remained stagnant at 2.5%.
The RBA's preferred measure, trimmed mean inflation, has edged up 0.1% to 2.8.
Are you worried about where core inflation is headed now?
So this 2.8% figure for trimmed mean inflation is not a complete guide to what is going to happen in the next few months.
And I was reading some headlines that told me that headline inflation remained at 2.5% in January, but core inflation rose slightly. Greg, could you just give us a quick reminder, what's the difference between headline inflation and core inflation?
Yeah, it's a really good question because it gets thrown around so much and there's this assumption everyone understands what core inflation is. And just to make sure it's even more trickier, sometimes it's called underlying inflation, just to really sort of throw a spanner in the works. So what we're talking about, headline inflation is just the consumer price index, which tries to capture everything that we spend each month in this case. And it's all weighted. So, they don't, the price of bread going up isn't weighted the same as the price of petrol going up because we generally spend more on petrol than we do on bread.
And petrol fluctuates a lot more.
Yeah,
already.
But, it takes all that into account. So the headline inflation CPI covers everything. And it can be a little bit bouncy. It can sort of go up and down a fair bit. At the moment, it's nice and steady at 2.5%. Then we have a thing called underlying or core inflation, which, to get even more technical, is known as the trimmed mean. Because what it does is essentially takes out sort of the top and the bottom of the big movers. So it just strips out the biggest and the smallest movers in the CPI each month or each quarter to try and get a sense of, well, what's actually happening kind of in the middle a bit, where, like 1 week there might be just a random big jump in petrol prices and then the next week it goes down. It kind of is like, do we want to be overreacting to all this? Let's just sort of calm down and look at what's going on in the middle. And the reason why that's important is because while the Reserve Bank does target CPI, does target that headline inflation, the underlying inflation gives them a bit of a sense of where is sort of the median long-term sort of inflation going. And that's good because if you are targeting inflation of between 2 and 3% and there's 1 month or 1 quarter where prices zoom up because maybe there was a cyclone, the price of bananas went up massively, then the Reserve Bank isn't going to react because they can look at underlying inflation and go, hey, nothing's really changed. And it's been important in the past couple of years because, yes, headline inflation has been coming down, but a lot of economists have, I think, kind of incorrectly been saying, oh, yeah, but underlying inflation, that core inflation still isn't below 3%. We shouldn't be cutting rates.
Yeah, well, that's like the big question on everybody's lips is what will happen when the RBA meets in early April. It's April 1st, isn't it?
Yep, April 1st. April Fool's Day. And
so everyone will be, well, many borrowers at least will be praying for a rate cut. And does this slight increase, or at least it's not a decrease, does that make it?
Yeah, look.
What are they going to do?
The underlying inflation measure went from 2.7 to 2.8. Kind of nothing really, and it's still within that 2 to 3% range. The one issue is the RBA generally doesn't care too much about monthly inflation. It cares more about the quarterly inflation because that is a lot broader. The ABS has only sort of in the last few years started doing the monthly measure, and it hasn't quite got to the point where it has as much statistical rigor as the quarterly one. So they kind of use it as a bit of a guide of how things are going, but they don't sort of swear by it. And the Reserve Bank is probably, I think, less likely to cut in April. It seems all the talk that they've been doing and all the expectations of the market is they'll probably keep them steady and wait until they get some bigger figures. But to be honest, they will already have got the big figures of the GDP, which comes out next week. If that's really bad, they might think, oh, things are actually worse than we thought. But, I think, if anything, this latest figure, which was for January, just shows that actually the inflation fight kind of is over. That doesn't necessarily mean the Reserve Bank's going to go on a rate cutting party.
Yeah, well, I guess the question is, has everyone been punished enough? Are people struggling enough that they really need that rate cut right now?
Oh, I think they definitely do. And I've certainly been, and listeners will know I've been arguing this for a long, long time. But, since rate rises went up, as I say, since rate rises started going up in the middle of 2022, half of the increase in the cost of living for people with mortgages is the increase in mortgage repayments. So it's been a massive impost on people with mortgages. It's also had flow-on effects into rents. One of the good things about this most recent figure does seem that rental price growth is, slowing, stabilizing. It's not going up like it was before. Doesn't mean it's coming down yet, but it does give a sense that, okay, those big price rises seem to be well behind us, but everyone was still feeling the effects of those rate rises. And when I say everyone, I'm really talking especially younger homeowners who took out a loan maybe in 2018, 2019. They're the ones who really got it in the neck. Older people who maybe took out their home loan 20 years ago, they're still pretty much doing okay.
Yeah, yep. Okay, so while we're talking about the cost of living, the government recently announced that they're going to fix our Medicare system to make going to the doctor free for 90% of visits, which is great. And I was reading that families could save up to $650 a year on their doctor visits.
Anthony Albanese has described this $8.5 billion Medicare boost as the beating heart of Labor's re-election pitch.
Extending bulk billing incentives from just children and pensioners to all patients.
Making it easier for Australians to see a GP for free wherever they live.
Only for that to be matched and then bettered by the coalition yesterday. So much for fiscal discipline on both sides.
Now, what about the money here, $8.5 billion? Where will that come from?
It's hard to think of a more appropriate use of public funds than to strengthen Medicare and help with the cost of living.
The coalition has been consistent in its commitment towards essential services, guaranteeing essential services going forward.
But from reading some of the headlines about this, it seemed a lot more scary than it actually is. It just sounds like going to the doctor will be cheaper or free for most people. But what did you read, Greg?
Look, I mean, when I saw it, I thought, $8.5 billion. And then you think, oh, yeah, that's a lot. And then I read, it's $8.5 billion over 4 years. And I think, actually, that's bugger all.
So, Greg, $8.5 billion over 4 years. Remind us how big the budget is, the annual spend of the Australian government?
Well, put it this way, in 4 years' time, in which case will be the last year of this $8.5 billion spend over that 4 years. In just that 1 year, the government is expected to spend $826 billion. So we're talking about an extra $2.1 billion on $826 billion. So
or like a fraction of a percent.
Yeah, it really is not much. And to be honest, when I was I thought it would actually have cost more than that, because I certainly haven't done the research on how much bulk billing would cost. And to get it up to this level, which they're suggesting about 90% of GP visits will be bulk billed, you think, really, we've been waiting around all because we didn't want to spend an extra $2 and a bit billion a year? I mean, what the hell, government? I mean, because really, in terms of the budget, that's kind of a rounding error, and it seems kind of bizarre that why hasn't this happened yet?
Oh, yeah, you're right. It's super bizarre. And do you think it comes back to the media and how they talk about this? Because there's so many people being like, oh my God, but how will they fund it? How are they going to pay for this?
Yeah,
this fraction of a percent of the budget.
Exactly. I mean, the government put out the $8.5 billion because that makes it sound like, oh, we're spending big on Medicare and on health, and people like a big number. But as I say, a bit over $2 billion a year. And yet straight away was, oh, what are you going to have to cut to pay for this? How are you going to pay for this? How's it going to be? And I think the Australian was leading on its front page suggesting that this is going to be the election campaign put on Australia's credit card, because governments are going mad. They're spending hand over fist. And I'm thinking, hang on, this is such a small impost, really.
Yeah.
It is very little, and yet this is one of the bugbears I always have with budgets, is this suggestion that everything, as soon as you propose something that is a good policy, it's, oh, how are we going to pay for this? Because there is this constant belief that the budget must be in surplus, the budget at least must be in balance, and a government is never allowed to spend money on a really good thing, which is going to help people, isn't going to affect inflation at all. It's not going to make people suddenly feel like they've had a big, cash splash and they've got money to go spend. It's actually just going to help lower the cost of living and also help health outcomes, because it is the main reason why people don't go to see the doctor, because it's not free for many people. And, I've been to a GP recently, it was $100, and it was just a sort of a checkup visit, and you're like, cripes, that's okay for me, I can afford it. But if I was, anyone on a single income with kids, or not on my above average income, because I'm not going to sort of suggest that I'm someone doing it tough, I think, cripes, you'd be like, actually, you know what? I'll put off going and get that mole check because it's going to cost me too much, or things like that. So this is a good policy, and yet straight away, because of this terrible pandemic of budget surplus mania, is that, oh, how are you going to pay for it?
So you're right, Greg. It's absolutely bizarre, because our government exists to do things that help us, but you wouldn't get that from reading the media, who, stoke up all this hysteria about these really good spending measures. Where does this bizarre obsession with budget surpluses come from?
Oh, look, it's a long-term thing. I mean, you could in some ways blame Paul Keating, because when he delivered a budget surplus in the 80s, he, of course, was, crowed about that and made sound like it was a great thing. And then basically a couple of years later, we had one of the deepest recessions in post-World War II history. But, and then Peter Costello took that and just ran with it, and really turned it into this sense that, a surplus is a bit like a profit. So if we're running a surplus, then it's like we're a really profitable country. And it's like, yeah, that's not how it is, because really people are like, what is a budget surplus? Well, what a budget surplus is the government has taken more taxes from us, from people, from companies, and given less of it back. In other words, they've decided, oh, you gave me $750 billion in taxes. Great. I'm going to give you $740 billion back. So look at me. I've made $10 billion surplus. Aren't I good? Give me a big pat on the back. And it's like, hang on. I gave you money and you're giving me, it's this bizarre thing where it said, oh, look, they're really prudent and they're running a good surplus. And it's like, no, all that has meant is the government has decided it wants to keep more of it, our taxes, than it wants to spend them. And
even if you sort of like play with the metaphor of the profit, like profit is only good like if you're the one getting it.
Yeah.
Like if they've got a big
exactly.
profit, like, okay, but does that flow into any benefits for the
Yeah,
people?
well, I mean, this was the thing. And a surplus is just a flow. It's just every year. It doesn't keep adding up to anything that we don't get. If it's a $10 billion surplus, we don't get a dividend payout as you do if you're a shareholder in a company. And one of the other bad things about the way we talk about a surplus is it becomes, and I've certainly fallen into this trap myself writing about it, we kind of think that surpluses are due to, there's been an increase in tax revenue, like oil prices have gone up, iron ore prices have gone up. So there's more company tax revenue than we expected. Oh, great, we've got a surplus. And yes, that's true, but it's kind of doing that really hides what really delivers a surplus. So let's say you've got a surplus of $5 billion. You haven't got that surplus because you got more taxes. You got that surplus because you looked at JobSeeker and the people on JobSeeker living in poverty and deciding, yep, I want those people to keep living in poverty so we can have a surplus. Government schools and looking at education expenditure and going, actually, I don't think we need more government expenditure on schooling. The conditions of public schools should be as poor as they are. That's why we've got a budget surplus. 25% or around 25% of Australian retirees are living in poverty. That's why there's a government surplus, because we decided we don't want to raise the age pension at a point which would mean we'd no longer have a surplus. So what happens in media commentary, and as I say, I've always done this, or often done it, is talks about surpluses. Oh, we've got more tax revenue. We never kind of think about, actually, the reason why we've got a surplus is because the government has chosen to keep services poorer, to keep people living in poverty, to keep doing all these things or not do these things that it could do. Because if it spent money on these people, lifting them up out of poverty, then there wouldn't be a surplus. And yet we kind of ignore that and just think, we had a big boom in tax and that's why we got a surplus. Isn't that wonderful? And it's like, yes and no.
Yeah, it's an incredible trick, isn't it, that they've done to sort of have that sort of myth be so pervasively believed.
It's a little bit like, how we talk about the cost of things, the cost of spending money on the age pension. We talk about that as a cost. We never talk really about the cost of tax breaks and other things.
Yeah, and what is the cost of having our age people or our retirees living in poverty? Like it's not like that money just goes and disappears. Like we're keeping people alive. We're keeping them in homes, like, and keeping them fed.
Yeah, I mean, we're a rich nation, a really rich nation, one of the richest in the world. We're talking pretty much you could throw a dart at a atlas, and any place that dart lands on, you're a very good chance to say, actually, it'd be worse to live there than live here in Australia. You'd be in a poorer country. And yet, that's not the case if you're a retiree, because there are plenty of other countries that have lower rates of poverty than we do. And because our tax system is so geared, and because our budget debate is so geared towards, surpluses are good, tax breaks don't really count as costs, that we end up with this situation where we have, for example, as we've spoken about many times, the superannuation system is giving, $20 billion or so to the richest 10%, and everyone thinking, oh yeah, that's fine. And if any government deigns to try and touch us, like, oh my God, you're killing our poor, self-funded retirees who have just done right and done the good thing and have been very thrifty. And it's like, no, they haven't been thrifty. They've taken advantage of some massive tax breaks.
Yeah, we've done some research on this recently, and I couldn't believe it when I read it that we spend pretty much just as much on giving out superannuation tax concessions as we do on the entire pension. Like, and to sort of look at those two things and those two amounts of money and be like, these are doing the same thing, and they're not. They're going to vastly different groups of people.
Yeah, exactly. More than half of the superannuations go to the richest, 10%.
Yeah.
Which you think, what possible public policy good is that serving? And I'm not saying, you can never give a tax cut to the richest or, never lower things but this is really about, as we've said repeatedly, superannuation is designed to help people save for retirement so as to lower the cost on the government of the age pension. But if you were never going to be on the age pension, then you don't need any incentive to not be on the age pension.
Yeah. Well, and we saw where this was going over like earlier this week. I saw you tweeting about a reader of the AFR who wrote in. Tell us, Greg. Well, they were stressing about their superannuation.
Look, Nikki and her husband were struggling, a bit apprehensive and worried because they both only have $2 million each in their super fund.
Only $2 million.
And they have expenses sometimes getting close to $300,000 a year. Help me with my budget. And crucially,
must be nice.
in the light, they were debt free, so it was like all of their expenses. It's not like they were having to pay their mortgage or anything like this. And to the AFR guy's credit, he replied to this letter with, "Yeah, you'll be fine. Don't worry." But also, what it really highlighted, one, there are some pretty entitled people out there. I'm surprised they weren't asking how they can also be eligible for the age pension, which you occasionally see. But the funny thing about them, or the incredibly sick funny thing about it was, okay, this couple, let's assume they actually do exist and it wasn't just the AFR writing a column to roll me, which can never be discounted. They both have $2 million each in their super, so $4 million overall. The government is at the moment trying to put through a measure to halve the tax concessions on super balances over $3 million from 30% to 15%. You still get a 15% tax break, you just no longer get 30%. If that got through, and it's currently being blocked in the Senate by the crossbenchers, this couple worrying about how are we going to get by with $2 million each in our super would not be affected. It wouldn't even affect them. That's how ludicrous this small change is that is getting blocked, and how just absolutely screwed the debate around tax and budgets and paying for things is. Here we are talking about lowering a tax break, not getting rid of it, lowering a tax break for people with $3 million in super individually, not even as a couple, and yet we're unable to get it past the Senate because there is this fear campaign that this is going to hurt your grandma. And if your grandma's got $3 million in super, you're one of maybe 40,000 people who have got a grandma with that amount, because there's only 80,000 people all up with more than 3 million super. Actually, probably even a quarter, maybe 10% of those would be women. So we're talking so small amounts, and yet our political debate is so wrecked that there is as much anger about trying to do that as there is from journalists explaining how are you going to fund this $2.5 billion increase in Medicare. And the reality is they actually would raise about the same amount if we were able to lower the tax concession on people with $3 million. $3 million in your super, that would raise about $2 billion a year, and that would fully fund the Medicare changes that would ensure 90% of your visits to the GP are bulk billed. And yet there is never this sense of, oh yeah, that sounds like a fair thing. It's like, oh no, you're robbing the people who have done good. And it's like, well, if you're going to have that attitude, then stop asking us how we're going to pay for this increase in GP bulk billing, because you clearly are not being honest about what the budget really is.
You can't have it both ways.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
And yet that is essentially where we are at the moment.
To end on a more positive note, how lucky are we that we live in a rich society and a democracy where we get to have a say in what our government does and doesn't do for us. And it might not always feel like that, but that's the job of us as citizens and us as the Australia Institute to continue pushing them. You know, that's what a democracy is all about, to ask for the things that are important, the things that you think will help your life and the people around you and your community. And even if you want to extend the net a little bit wider, the vulnerable people in Australia who may not have a voice as strong as yours, Greg, or mine, to push for things that can help people like that.
Yeah,
and we're getting there.
We here at the Australian Institute, we certainly do slap the government a fair bit, especially on things like gas and the Morgee and skate and things like that, and deservedly so, I think. But we also, as I say, this spending on the GP bulk billing, about the only criticism I have is, why didn't you do it sooner? I think it would have been better politics and policy to do it sooner. But again, it's this case of, let's also, all of us, push back on this sense that, how are we going to pay for these things? Until you actually have someone who is prepared to actually say, look, I don't mind the fact that we are giving away $27 billion a year in revenue to the richest 10% for their superannuation tax breaks, for their negative gearing, and for their capital gains discount. If you're okay with that, then shut up about how we're going to spend $2 billion on bulk billing. Unless you are saying also, well, let's reduce that to pay for something else, then I'm going to listen to you. Until then, you are basically being a hypocrite. And I think we all should be kind of sick of that, because it ends up being, all the talk about how you're going to pay for that is always about stuff that is helping lower middle income earners. We never hear it about defense. We never hear it about these massive tax breaks. And I'm sorry, that's a pretty terrible political debate, and I'm done with it.
Yeah. Yeah, God, defense, like they just need to shake the can a little bit, and then $10 million will come raining out of the sky for a new fancy helicopter or whatever they need. It's wild. And yeah, we just need to keep asking. Like, you can't have it both ways, that defense and whoever else gets as much money as they could ever need, because of course that's important. But then we can't live in a society where we let our retirees live comfortable lives. We're told that we need to condemn, 23% of our retirees to live in poverty, something like that. Which to me, it doesn't make sense. I am very happy for my tax dollars that I pay to go towards like living in a society where we look after our vulnerable people and have world-class services.
Seems pretty clear that is a good thing.
Yeah, well, let's keep saying it, Greg. Well, thanks for having me on the show, your show. It's funny to me being the host of your show, but anyway.
Or is it Eleanor's show? I think that's the key thing. It's Eleanor's show.
Well, Greg, thanks for having me on. It's been a delight fixing inequality, fixing the economy with you.
Yep. I mean, everyone stay angry. Don't settle for the current situation. We can have better, and we should have better. But thank you, everyone, for listening. Thank you, Hayden, for stepping in for Eleanor. We will be back with another Dollars and Cents next week. And next week, it's GDP week. Yay!
Woohoo! Yeah.
Christmas in March. Oh, my God. It's March next week. But, yep, GDP, so we will be all over that. This episode of Dollars and Cents was recorded on Thursday, the 27th of February, and some things may have changed. My Blue Sky handle, and the handle I use at all other social media, is @GrogScammit, and Hayden is at
Hayden Star.
Hayden Star. He is our social media guru here at the Australia Institute, so if you're leaving nasty comments on the Australia Institute
I'll come
account,
find
he's
you.
the one who has to read them. So be nice and praise him, because he does great work. My column, which looks at all the costs of superannuation and negative gearing and capital gains tax and just how dishonest our debate is, can be found on the Guardian Australia site. But for more research on really how badly our tax system is broken and needs to be fixed, and all other research on things like the Maugean skate and the Great Gas Giveaway, go to our website, australiainstitute.org.au.
And the best way to stay up to date with all the work of the Australia Institute, apart from listening to Greg's fantastic podcast, of course, is probably our newsletter, Between the Lines, which we send out every fortnight. It's completely free. I write it along with the fabulous Amy Ramikis, who writes a bit of a political analysis of the week. And you can find that over on our website as well. There's a sign-up button that will take you right to it.
Yep, fabulous newsletter, and Amy always leads it off with a really good column that is well worth reading and subscribing to, so get on to that. Our music, as always, is by Blue Dot Sessions. Everyone, have a great week. We'll see you all next week.
Adios.